I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. Today we speak about conscious parenting while facing collapse with philosopher, activist, and collapse-aware parent, Terry Rankin. Okay. Welcome to another round of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, and this is yet another episode of a special side project, a special focused series that we call Take My Hand, Conscious Parenting in a Time of Stolen Dreams. Really have been finding a tremendous amount of value and a remarkable amount of vulnerability and generous sharing in this series. It really is a privilege to be involved with it. And today, I am certain will be no exception. I've had the opportunity to meet Terry Rankin through this, my peripheral involvement with the Deep Adaptation Forum. Jem Bendel's creation, one of his creations around his work of deep adaptation. And, that being focused on the current state of collapse of certain human and Earth systems and the inevitability of more. And what the point of this secondary series, this series focused on parenting in times of collapse, is really to give parents, people who are both parents and collapse aware, an opportunity to speak their heart, to share with one another what they're seeing, what they're going through, what their challenges are, and what they see for their own children and for the children in their communities. What seems to be the case is in many, many communities around the world, but especially in the more privileged countries, there's still an awful lot of denial in the space. There's still an awful lot of willful ignorance. And, sometimes that's not such a bad thing. I can certainly understand it if I were a parent in this time, which I am not. If I were a parent in this time, I don't know that I would be able to speak directly with my child about what's actually going on, the existential nature of the current state of affairs on the planet. And in my earlier conversation with Terry, I just was really struck. We were talking not so much about parenting, but really about his take on various ways of framing these challenges on a far more just an adult scale and a professional scale, looking at possible facilitation and workshops and so on. So we may touch a little bit on that, but really why I wanted him to come was that he has that ability to articulate a unique, different way of framing what we're all looking at. And I just really couldn't wait to hear him include the issues that are current for someone who is a parent and collapse aware. And then on top of that, someone who's really spent some time articulating a different frame for how we might look at and hold in context these trying times. So Terry, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. And I'm wondering if you could add anything to that introduction. How would you like to be known? What is it you'd like to be known for? Can you give us a little bit of an introduction?
Well, I'll spare you the thumbnail bio because I don't want to preach my resume. But how would I like to be known? To some extent, I think I already have earned this. What I'd like to be known above all else is that I will tell you the truth and I'll describe reality truthfully. I'm a philosopher, and that's how I want to be known. I'm a Diogenes carrying that lantern looking for an honest man who can appreciate the truth and reality that I think I see and help me deal with it. So, a seeker and teller of truth and reality is probably the way I want to best be known as a
Great.
philosopher. And so I've done pretty well. I'm not an academic philosopher. I don't teach philosophy. I have in the past, but I'm not looking to be in academia. Uh, that's as far from reality for the most part as one can get these days,
Fair enough.
unless you're in the banking industry.
Mhm. I'm curious, Terry, how many kids you got, and what are their ages?
I have a stepdaughter, my wife's daughter by her first marriage, who is, I don't, she's in her early 40s, but she probably wouldn't be mad at me for saying that. She's married to a great son-in-law. They live in San Jose, and they have no kids by deliberate choice, I think. Um, and he works for Google, so they are doing quite well, and they are living the San Jose, Silicon Valley lifestyle.
Mhm.
I have conversations with her about all this when we visit, but it's not something that they're steering their life around,
Yeah.
kind of like I am. We also have a daughter. My wife and I have a daughter of our own who is a 30 something millennial, 33, 32. She's also married. She's a successful photographer and her husband's a successful filmmaker. So they're both very creative. They're both self employed. And they have three grandkids, or three kids that are our grandkids. They have the oldest is our granddaughter Amelie, in the French spelling, Amelie.
Hmm.
She's 9 this month. Just a couple of days ago was her 9th birthday. And then she has a younger brother, Justice, who is 7, and he will be 8 next year. And then there's a new one who's just over a year old, Bodevin. And it took me a while to figure it out, but all three of those names have movie connections.
Ah,
Amelie is a French kind of anime, real film cult movie,
yeah.
which I haven't seen in the English version yet. Justice is the Justice League of America kind of thing, right? And Bodevin, I struggled to figure that one out for a while, but then I remembered the movie Captain Fantastic, I think it is,
Mm.
who has Viggo Mortensen as the lead role. His eldest son's name was Bodevin.
Ah,
So
okay.
anyway, that's the family profile.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. So, I sent you a list of questions that, we loosely hold to in these interviews. They almost always vary from, person to person. I'm curious, what were the stories? What were the images that were conveyed one way or another to you as a young person growing up? What it would be like to be an adult, and particularly what would it be like to be a parent? Could you
Okay,
share a little bit about your growing up and
sure,
how you were impressed upon with those images?
certainly, certainly. There are three dimensions to it, I think, and I'll try to stick to these three. First, I was an only child, which has a whole story around itself, but I was born in 1949. So this was when Dr. Benjamin Spock's gospel of child rearing was dominant. So that was the frame that my parents put in place. And what that framework for child rearing does is uh, cultivate and nurture and nourish free thinking, free roaming, independence, liberty, unlimited kind of childhood. And that puts deep roots into how one develops as an adult. I mean, on the downside, as an only child, the downside of that is you become very egocentric, very condescending, very self-centered, and very manipulative. So it has its downside. But the upside of it is you think for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You really do think for yourself.
Yeah.
And questions become more meaningful than answers because the questions persist, the really important ones persist, while the answers are always changing to those really important questions. Hence, by the time I was 12, I was a philosopher before I knew what it meant to be one. Because my parents answered questions with questions more often than they said, oh, well, it's this, you know. I don't remember having any prohibitions. I remember getting in trouble a few times, but I don't remember being severely punished. I remember being bailed out, you know, and both literally
Yeah.
and morally, or well, conscientiously. So there's that whole dimension of it. That was the gospel according to Benjamin Spock context. Also, we lived in a small college town in central Kentucky, Richmond, Kentucky, where Eastern Kentucky University is. And my dad had a business right on Main Street. He was an electrician out of the Korean, well, between the two wars, World War II and Korean War.
Mm-hmm.
He went into the Army and got trained as an electrician, and he came back and started a business. We lived in my grandfather's hotel. He had a hotel for his Spanish-American War buddies. And while they were just newlyweds and I was a newborn, we had an apartment in the back of the hotel, and he ran his business out of the lobby section that he, you know, built out to be his electrical business. So by the time I was still in training pants when I was wandering up and down the street and Main Street, getting in all kinds of trouble as a toddler, you know. But it's a small town, so every businessman on Main Street knew every other businessman on Main Street, and they all watched out for each other and each other's kids. And that went on until I was, 12 or 13 years old. So that leads me to the second context of my social imaginary, if you will. That's a phrase from Charles Taylor, philosopher. And your social imaginary is what your culture teaches you about who you are and how to be.
Right.
Well, movies. There were two movie theaters. One was across the first street at the end of the block. And my dad had made an agreement with the management that if I showed up and wanted to go to a movie, just put it on the bill and he'd pay for it. And so I went to movies whenever I felt like it. By the time I was 4 or 5 years old, I was spending all day Saturday watching serials, Hopalong Cassidy, Lash LaRue, any of that rings a bell. Gene Autry, Roy and Dale, all of those things. And Cisco Kid, geez, how they come back. And double feature movies. And there was another theater about 4 or 5 blocks further down the street on the other side. By the time I was 7 or 8, I was going to that one. I'd go to one in the morning and watch the serials. I'd go to the other one in the afternoon and watch the cartoons and watch more double feature movies. There were no ratings in those days. So some of the movies I saw were kind of baffling. There were no X-rated films playing in public theaters in those days, but things like Tennessee Williams, black and white versions of Tennessee Williams stories, and lots of Doris Day and Rock Hudson, you know. So it was a very lush fantasy context, okay, to be exposed to all those movies. Now, the character that it instilled in me was that cowboy, you know, be that adventurer, be that hero, be that cowboy, you know, and all those different faces that the hero wears. So that was really the second context. The third context, I would say, was more, my dad was a craftsman and an artist, in addition to being an electrician. He was a jack of all trades, came from a huge Depression era family. I think he had 9 or 10 siblings. And there wasn't anything he couldn't do for himself. I mean, he was the epitome of the self-reliant fellow. All crafts. He had a workshop in the basement that he knew where the master switch was. When we moved into the second house, he knew where the master switch was, and I was still a toddler. So he could turn all the electricity off in the basement so I wouldn't get into the power tools. Because if I had, I'd be sitting here quadriplegic probably. You know, I would have lost all kinds of digits and limbs. So anyway, he took, if I ever had anything like an unspoken connection to someone, it was to him.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we just were always on the same wavelength. He didn't have to talk to me. I didn't have to talk to him. It wasn't mind reading. I don't want to say it was ESP, but we just had a rapport
Yeah.
that was profoundly strong.
Hmm.
And it persisted until his death, 20 years ago or so. So those are the three contexts: my mother and father. My mother was the intellectual. She was always wanting to argue politics and get together with college professors and people and talk the issues of the day and party politics and all this. She was a Roosevelt liberal, I guess is the easiest way to describe her. And that too persisted until her death.
Yeah.
So there was that family intimacy that was intellectual and artist in a good balance.
Mm-hmm.
And there was the context of the culture, mainly around movies and television. And there was the gospel according to Benjamin Spock.
Mm-hmm.
And what that taught me about being a parent was I have to protect my children without them knowing I'm doing it as much as I can. I have to let them have all the freedom to fall off the bike, but I want to make sure they're riding in the grass when they do. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Not in front of the cars in the street. I mean, that's a simple metaphor, but
Yeah.
that kind of sets the stage for how to be a good parent of a young child.
Yep.
Now, I did not go through the classic teenage rebellion. Most kids, when they hit their teens, 13, 14 years old, they just rebel against their parents and just clam up, disappear, and stay out of their parents' lives. I didn't do that. All the kids that I hung around with in high school came to my house because they wanted to be around me and my parents.
Yeah.
So I never knew what that detachment felt like. So that was a huge factor in giving me an idea how to parent, because my parents were just as tolerant, and well, tolerance an understatement, liberal and freewheeling with my friends as they were with me.
Yeah.
And my friends ate it up. The
Yeah.
big thing then was smoking cigarettes, of course.
Yeah.
And they could smoke in front of my parents. Every other parent would smack their kids silly if they saw them with a cigarette, pretty much.
Well, let
So
me.
all of that together gave me a sense of how to be a parent to a child, and how to be an adult is really still around that philosopher trying to tell the truth, see the truth, and share it.
Yeah. So now, flash forward to today, because it sounds like you brought a tremendous amount of exactly what you're describing to your own parenting, which is quite a while ago now. You know, you're not raising, you know, malleable young minds into young adulthood now. You've already done the parenting, but you know what it is to parent. You also have that propensity to telling the truth and to seeing where they rub right up against each other. The challenge of being a parent on a good day, and then add to that the irritation of looking into this future and seeing that it just can't be the same way that it was. And I'm wondering
Sure.
if you could share what you see that needs to be different, or that is different, whether we like it or not these days.
I would liken it, the closest analogy I could come to in my own youth and childhood was the nuclear fear that we lived with. The nuclear attack drills that you had in school, you would dive under a desk, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Families who built fallout shelters. They
Yeah,
knew a
duck and
couple of
cover, man.
those.
Duck and cover.
Yeah. Uh, this is rather like that, although it's at best a loose analogy. Um, the part of the analogy that's good is that it's a pervasive fear that we felt most keenly during the missile crisis in 63, 62 in Cuba. That's when we were most on edge about it. And I remember that vividly, just like I remember the assassination the following year, but all of that's on the side. What I think is unique and not quite fitting into that analogy is there's no place to duck.
Mm-hmm.
There's no cover to go to.
Right.
There's no fallout shelter to escape into. There's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide this time. And we have already pushed the red button.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the differences. So there's no verbal conversation I can have with my kids, my adult children, that I think would be helpful. They know this. They know the reality of what's coming in the marrow of their bones. They read the signs just as well as I do. The dissonance that they live with is they can't look up from the day to day long enough to even ponder how to deal with it.
Right.
What they do is, and it's a blessing for me to be able to say this, but what they're doing is they're raising their kids to love the outdoors, to be creative in living with the outdoors, and in the natural state of the outdoors, and to be able to find their own fulfillment and peace in that setting.
Mm.
Now, what that means is, of course, those grandkids are going to come into a world where that setting doesn't exist anymore, or at least it's not accessible to them the way it is today. I mean, they're seeing the last vestiges of state of nature on this planet.
Yeah.
It's gone. It'll be mostly gone in your lifetime and mine,
Yep.
or our access to it. And by the time my grandkids are in their late teens or early 20s, which is a decade from now, they won't be able to get to it unless they've moved to it.
Yep.
North, west, and high altitudes, or north and into high altitudes. So when it comes to my kids, my adult children, I just try to help them parent what they're doing, because they're doing good and right things. Mm-hmm. Is it focused on survivability or sustainability or resilience or any of that? Not really. Not in the climate crisis sense that those terms are normally taken. It's focused on the survivability, sustainability, and resistance of their identities, which is, I think, the right thing to do. They'll have to adapt that identity to a world that we can't describe.
Yeah.
They'll have to just find themselves in it and remain themselves in it as best they can. So when it comes to them, and especially to the grandchildren, I try to kind of counsel when asked, advise if invited,
yeah,
into how to focus on what I think are the key two things for this crisis we're in now and in the future. The key two things are going to be, you have to cherish those you love and comfort them. You don't know what's coming, but you know that if people don't feel loved and can't be comforted, we're doomed. Mm. So you really have to focus on comforting and cherishing the people you love most, starting with your immediate family, and grow that out to secondary tiers of family, your inner circles, and out to friends that are the most dear. And if you can get that far before the water hits the wheel, that's not what I really want to say. I really want to say when the shit hits the fan. But when it gets to that state, that's where you want to be. You want to be in that state where you are resilient, surviving, and connected with people you love, who love you and know you and understand you. Yeah. You may not survive 6 months in that state, but it's better to die in that state than to die terrified and lost and unknowing. I'd rather die in the truth than live in a lie. And I think ultimately so would everybody else. Yeah. Which is part of the real problem we're living in now, is everywhere we look, we're being lied to. Yeah. So does that answer the question?
It absolutely does, and I appreciate it. It blends so well with a number of the elements of my way of framing this predicament that we're in. Is that really what got us here? Is that we unconsciously, for the most part, agreed to disconnect from all the primary sources of meaning in a human life in order to be a part of this fossil fuel fandango that we've been in, that's gotten us here. And those are those elements I break down into deeper self, our connection with others, our connection with the earth, and even our connection with our own soul. And so it really is a great fit how you just were, beautifully laying out your way of saying it, that in order to thrive in any way in these coming times, whatever the future is that you're seeing, whatever the timeline is that you've chosen to land in, what I heard you saying was that the reconnection with others in as deep a way as you can possibly muster is one of those essential pieces of moving forward and staying sane. Again, no matter what the timeline is, no matter what the horizon is that you painted for yourself. And
as black as the picture gets, the only light in it comes from that within that you give to others.
Right. So I know that you have a really broad horizon, so to speak. And if we look out at, just from our earlier conversation, I remember you speaking about not just a climate change focus, which I'm always a bit concerned about. While I know it gets the most press, I think you and I both know that it's just a small fragment of a symptom of the human-caused collapse of Earth and human systems that we're in. And so I was really refreshed by our earlier conversation, and you've even mentioned it a little bit in this one, that there are other elements that we need to be attending to, perhaps even more important and more urgently than climate change. You mentioned about the elements of nature around us and what we can plainly see, not to mention what we also, if we spend half a moment looking for the news that is, you can find it. It's definitely there. I'm curious if you could share a little bit about when you look out in this world and you start to take a tally of the things that really land heavy on your heart, whether it's economics, politics, whether it's the health of the oceans, if it is climate change. I'm just curious, what are the concerns that land heavy on you when you look out there?
Well, that's a tough one. In doing my doctoral research, working on my dissertation, I came up with a phrase that kind of encapsulates how I think of the state we're in. And it's pretty common knowledge that we're in what's called the sixth mass extinction, right? That's a pretty, that's the umbrella phrase for what's going on that is most widely seen. And I'm fine with it. I think it's correct. Scientifically, I think it's on the money. Because in mass extinction, you don't just lose a few birds and a few fish and a few trees and a few plants. You lose most of the biomass on the planet.
Yeah.
And that's what we're looking at. Most of the life on this planet, all the species, including humans, is going to be eviscerated, decimated. Now, that's a staggering thing to say. And when you let those words sink in, the first reaction is shock, and then there's anger, and then there's grief for me.
Yeah.
So the reality and truth of that sixth mass extinction, which, by the way, I turned into an acronym. It's round 6 of mass extinction level events on Earth. And if you acronym that, it's MELEE, melee, R6, melee round 6. I really like that acronym for that concept. And I use it in my writing a lot. But in any case, if you let the reality and the truth of that just kind of filter down into your whole consciousness and lower, what I found was the marrow of my bones is waiting there for me to figure this out. It's already resonating with this. My very being below my conscious mind, below my sensory awareness, is already living in that reality. I know this in the marrow of my bones. I'm just figuring it out consciously and through my senses. But my body, my being in the presence of this truth and reality has been aware of it for a long time. It's been reading signs a long time before I figured it out. And that being the case, it kind of, for a while, the burden on me was to tell that story, wake people up, bring the deniers out of the delusion that they were living with. And that just took a while to get through. And I worked it through. I was in Extinction Rebellion for nearly a year. And I realized they want us to do two things. They want us to become activists and try to urge or push or force the government into solving this problem. Well, to me, that's just not going to happen. So I'm kind of meandering around the question, I think, but are you putting this diagram up that I'm seeing?
Yeah, I am.
Okay, all right, let me talk to it from that perspective.
Okay.
These are the three things that are happening. Round 6 of mass extinction level events on Earth. And the two things in that reality, it's happening. It's not coming, it's not imminent, it's not near, it's here. We're in it, and we've been in it for quite a while. That's the scientific truth and reality has confirmed that. There's now a 100% consensus on this. People don't look to that, and there's the counter argument, well, science is never 100% certain of anything. All right, you want to argue about how many nines are to the right of that decimal point? Go argue with somebody else. 99.9 is enough 100% for me. That comes out of an article that showed up in a SAGE journal. Anyway, I can provide that if needed. But the science is totally confirmed that says that's where we are, that's what's happening. And the most visible symptoms of this, exactly as you suggested, Dean, are climate change. I want to come back to that, and ecosystem collapse. I'll come back to that point about climate change in a second. The third dimension of that, however you take this, is a spiritual truth and reality. You mentioned the soul earlier. Well, that's a spiritual statement. I mean, a soul is, unless you're an absolute atheist or an entrenched agnostic, there is spiritual reality, there is spiritual truth, even if it's only the human spirit as a collective kind of being that transcends the mere physical. Even if it's only that, there is a spiritual truth and reality to be dealt with here. Christians, Jews, Islam, Buddhists, Confucianists, pick your faith, humanist, agnostic, atheist, they all fall into that green circle somewhere. Now the trick, not trick, but the challenge, the problem, the question of the age is how do we make the yellow, the purple, and the cyan happen? How do we bring these into what I call resonant harmony? This is not a diagram of set theory. This is not a Venn diagram. It's used that way. Those purple, cyan, white, and yellow areas are not set intersections where you're talking about what the red has in common with the blue and what the blue has in common with the green. That's set theory. What this is about is more like music. It's where the song that the sixth mass extinction is singing is in resonant harmony with scientific truth and reality. They're both wholly present in that purple area.
Yeah.
Same thing in the cyan area. Well, let's go back to the red and the green. The sixth mass extinction being in resonant harmony with the spiritual truth and reality of who you are as a human being and who we are as a living species on this planet. It's hard to say that there's some kind of intersection or union or any of those set theory things. When you think about it as two voices in musical harmony, now you've got two whole things that are bound together in a third thing, resonant harmony. When you put the spiritual truth together with the science, and that's a question for the ages, right? The humans have been debating that since ancient Greece, but they can be put in resonant harmony. They just rely on different evidence. They rely on different data. They rely on different experiences. So the value of that diagram to me is that it speaks to the resonant harmony of these things that are in such paradoxical conflict. Our faith in science has been in paradoxical conflict since the Enlightenment, 500 years ago. Our sixth mass extinction, what kind of rational science brings about a sixth mass extinction? There's no such thing as a rational science that would do that.
Yeah.
Yet here we are. And by the same token, how is that mass extinction in any kind of resonant harmony with our spiritual nature as humans? Whatever that spiritual nature is. So these, to me, are the key problems.
Yeah.
And how to establish resonant harmony in those secondary colors, especially in the middle. That white triangle in the middle where they all three come into a barbershop trio, if you will.
Yeah.
Where it's three voices singing on the same page in the same key and different melodies.
Yeah.
I really like the metaphor, so pardon me for dwelling on it.
Well, I especially this time around, hearing you describe some of the elements of your work, I'm reminded of a guy who's been on this particular focused podcast, and then my Poetry of Predicament as well. A guy named Michael Dowd, and he's a non-sectarian pastor, and I know that he comes from the evangelical side of Christianity, but he's since become far more, gosh, I'm gonna not remember the exact way he couches it, but his gospel is in what is actually present in our world. And so often when you're speaking about that intersection, that everything you were just talking about, that intersection of the spiritual language that you're bringing in with its resonance with the science. Every time you lay that out, I hear more and more similarity to the gospel, if you will, from Reverend Dowd. And so I'm going to be sure to put your interview in the series of these interviews right next to Michael Dowd's. I think it's going to be very, very useful to have you two kind of pointing at each other in important ways. So we started that with what breaks your heart about the world today. Could you bring that in, what you were just describing, to your own experience in your own heart? Let me give you an example from my own life. I have long been an ocean person. When I was growing up in a very, very troubled household, a lot of alcoholism and a lot of craziness, and where I found healing and where I found really a salvation of sorts was to be able to go to the ocean. And that has lasted through my whole life. And what has been breaking my heart about this earth, this planet, and this sixth mass extinction that you so beautifully laid out there that we are in, has been how really poorly the oceans are doing. And that breaks my heart. And I can point to sooner than 2050, both the coral reefs, excuse me, both the coral reefs and the world's fisheries are expected to be fully collapsed before 2050. And we're already at roughly the halfway point of what was the standard amount of phytoplankton in the ocean when you and I were young or born. We now have 50% less phytoplankton in the ocean. And just a little point of perspective here, my understanding is that there is a range of interpretation of how much phytoplankton provides in terms of the oxygen for the planet. and it's somewhere between half and three quarters of the Earth's oxygen, and there's now half of that
Yeah.
available. So that's the kind of thing I'm sharing when I'm talking about things that just I need to stop for a moment and just breathe to realize what I'm even saying. And I'm curious if there's anything that's landing like that for you that you might share.
Uh, First and foremost is my grandkids.
Hmm.
I mean, there are times, even now, it chokes me up to think about it. There are times when I'm out like camping with them, or they're just visiting, um, and I just see such innocence in their being who they are. And I know that's going to die. I know it's going to die sooner than it should. And that breaks my heart more than anything else.
Yeah.
Um, like I say, I can't think about it.
Yeah.
um, I can, but it always tears me up to do it because I know that's coming. And I know my kids are going to have to watch it happen to their kids.
Yeah.
And my wife and I are going to have to watch it happen to them as the parents of those kids watching it happen.
Hmm.
That's the heartbreak for me.
Yeah.
Now, that's the very personal heartbreak and the biggest heartbreak of the whole story.
Yeah.
But I would footnote that to say there's not a day that goes by that several things don't pop up in the news that break my heart. Along the lines of what you were saying about the phytoplankton, I think I read somewhere where if it hasn't already happened, it's imminent, that there's the mass of garbage in the oceans is greater than the mass of living matter.
Yeah.
I, I mean, wrap your head around that.
Yeah.
And you know, you just, what kind of science would let this happen? Well, I know the answer to that question, but it's a whole other topic.
Right. Right. Well, I got another question for you, and I know you know which one I'm headed toward, and it's the one that I know you said was particularly an uncomfortable one to consider,
Yeah.
and that is, I'm wondering if you could let us know when you think of the word hope in the context of what we're talking about right now.
Mhm.
I'm curious how you might define it, and if I could just give you again another example from one of my many conversations. I call them my impossible conversations with people over these years. Uh, all too often, when I ask this question of how do you define hope, really, bless their hearts, people really don't know what they're talking about. It's oftentimes the first time they've had to define it because they just throw it around like they know what they're talking about. And so when they throw it around, when they throw out their first definition, often it has something similar to, gee, I hope the experts solve all these pesky problems so we can get back to business and life as usual, which is the fossil fuel extravaganza that we've all
Right.
grown up in. And I know that that's not what you're thinking about. I'm just guessing, but I'm pretty certain that that is not anywhere near how you would define hope. So I'm just curious, how would you?
There are two parts to that answer that I try to keep in resonant harmony. Bear with me here, and I'll read you a short poem, and you should recognize it. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul. That's my favorite definition. And sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could have bashed the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. So that's one.
Yeah.
And the other is because I'm a Christian, hope is a dimension of faith. And there's a verse, I'm pretty sure that it's in Hebrews, one of the first verses. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things unseen. And so those are the two pillars of what I take hope to be. It's a dimension of faith, and it's also what Emily Dickenson describes in her poem. Now, having said that I'm a Christian, let me be clear about that. I'm not a proselytizer. I'm not an evangelist. I don't pretend to have any gospel but Christ. And that's not something I can put into words. It's already there. Go read the book. I would say that if I had to characterize my Christian faith, I'm a dissident Christian in this world. I'm a stranger in a strange land. And in that truth that is biblical, if this is not my home, I have a home elsewhere, I find hope in that.
Yeah.
And those are the two dimensions of it for me.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's
Sorry, I got choked up there.
entirely, well, I can't imagine a more important element to bring for each of us in our own way is the tears of what at our core resides as hope. So Terry, I thank you for that.
Yeah.
It's not something to want to avoid here. I invite them, and thank you very, very much. And I'm curious, could you remind me what's the name of that Emily Dickenson poem?
Hope is the thing with feathers.
Hope is the thing with feathers.
It's very short. It's 12 lines.
I'm curious if you could share with us, how do you keep yourself open? How do you keep your heart available with all that you see in this world, all the things you've been describing to us that are the truly the predicaments that we're all facing? I'm curious, how do you keep yourself regulated, in somewhere near the state that allows you to stay connected with yourself, with your faith, with others?
You ask good questions. It's a progression. I mean, it changes every day. It's a dynamic that is hard to boil down to its critical mass, but it comes to something like this. I've known since my pubescent years that I was going to die. We all know we're going to die. It's just a question of how and when, right? And the fact that my life is going to turn out, apparently, by all the signs I'm reading, to end in relatively natural circumstances, barring some kind of unforeseen accident or thing. I'm going to get sick. I probably cancer. There's cancer in my family. There's heart disease. There's all kinds of highly probable ways that I'm going to die. So coming to grips with the reality that I might just end up dying in a concentration camp, starving to death, because of what has to happen after the systemic collapse of civilization as we know it, that's just an unexpected turn of events. And I really don't think I'm as likely to see that. I'm more likely to have a wreck on a motorcycle, and I don't even own a motorcycle. So those keeping things in perspective, I guess, is the short answer. From the perspective of knowing I'm going to die anyway, seeing this as how I'm going to die, most likely, or quite possibly, just changes the story. It doesn't change the meaning of my life. It just changes the last scene a little bit. You see what I mean?
Yes.
Now, if I were 30 something, it would be a whole different matter to consider. Because if I were 30 something, I'd have to be facing the reality that I'm most likely going to end up living in concentration camp circumstances under martial law, you know, in a brutally totalitarian global tyranny. I think that's where things go after systematic collapse. And we've seen that over and over again throughout history, including recent history in Eastern Europe, for instance, and in the Horn of Africa, and so on and so on and so on. So it's a different story for your age. For my age, I take actually some comfort in knowing that my life is going to end in a relatively familiar way. It may happen suddenly, car wreck, motorcycle wreck, shot
Yeah.
in a drive-by shooting accident, who knows? But those kinds of things have certain actuarial dimensions to them that I've already reconciled myself to.
Yeah.
The fact that this new scenario comes into the script is just another scenario.
Yeah.
So reconciling death is not an issue for me. It's how to make life meaningful. That's what keeps me going.
Yeah.
How can I make it meaningful today, right now? This dialogue with you is making my life meaningful today.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I seek, is ways and places and relationships in which I can make it meaningful.
Really well said. There's just a way that you bring the elements together that you do that is pretty darn unique. It really is you and Michael Dowd that tend to bring similar elements together, different than just about anybody else I get the opportunity to speak with. You know, I'm curious, if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to. I'm not a big fan, and I don't really ever hear you go this way either, but I'm not a big fan of advice. So I'm really not asking for advice here, but I'm aware that there are plenty of folks who will be watching this series, this Take My Hand, conscious parenting in a time of stolen dreams. There are plenty of parents that I've already spoken to in this series that they just literally don't have the space to be able to do the contemplation and the integration and the conjuring that you're doing to come up with your body of work and your perspective. And I know that it takes something. It really takes something to be able to free up enough of our attention to be able to look, get our head above water and to get a broader perspective. It takes something. And I'm wondering, because it seems like you have something to say about that. You've got some mileage on that. You have gained that perspective, that open perspective. I'm wondering if you could share with some of the folks who don't yet have that, and they don't really even know how to get that. If you could share pieces that have been valuable for you, of anywhere from keeping your heart open, as we were just talking about,
Mhm.
to how to keep some kind of an open perspective when our society around us, when our global culture is wanting to shut down and go into fear and hold on and be polarized and so on. I'm wondering if that sparks you to say anything.
I'm not very good at giving advice.
Yeah.
I'm good at having conversations. I'm good at having dialogue, but boiling things down to, 3 bullet points of how to make yourself happy, and I'm being facetious,
Yeah.
is not my wheelhouse. But I would say I've already touched on the key things.
Yes.
Have an open heart, but pour that heart into those you love most.
Yeah.
And pour that heart into comforting them, because their need for comfort may not be here yet, but it's coming.
Yeah.
So learn to be a comforter. That's my first bit of advice to everybody.
Mm.
Learn to be a comforter with love, and start with your immediate nuclear family and expand from there very carefully and selectively. You know, this
Yeah.
is not a time to love the world because the world doesn't love you. So don't waste time on that front. This is a time to love those most dear to you and shelter and protect and comfort them from the world. So that's my first bit of advice. And the other is kind of the other side of that coin. Don't hide the truth and reality of the science first. The science is on the money. We just don't have the whole story yet because the science is politicized. So don't try to get the whole story politically, scientifically, economically, socially. Don't try to absorb that whole story because it's not there to be absorbed. The effort that it takes to parse through the propaganda and parse through the dissonance and get to the underlying kernels of truth that you can bring into a resonant harmony for a worldview, it took me a lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been a philosopher since I was in my teens, at least. And this doctoral work is the arc of that life story. And I had to bring everything I knew to bear, which had a lot of study in philosophy of science. So don't waste your time doing what I've done. You don't have time to do what I've done. But just take it from me. Open your heart, guard your heart, pour it into your immediate family and those you love most, and be a comforter. That's the cornerstone of my advice. Now, be informed, but know the truth. It's coming, it's here, and it's going to get horrible when systems start collapsing, especially the food supply chain, which will go first. And when these things start falling apart, there won't be any more denial. And there won't be any more, where do I go from here? How do I get out of this? That's not going to happen. So the only thing left is to cling to those and love and comfort and secure those you love most. Pour all of your heart into that.
Yeah.
The truth is going to run over you. Don't worry about seeing it coming any more clear than it's coming.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know whose word you have to take to know that it's coming. Mine, yours, Dean, Jim Bendell's, Rupert Reed's, Roger Hallam's. I don't know, you know, pick your scientist, pick your activist. But it is coming. And, you know, if you want to stay informed, then pick your sources carefully. But don't worry so much about understanding it as just knowing it's coming.
Yeah.
I mean, that it almost doesn't make sense as I'm saying it. This is a very hard thing to put words around. But the bottom line is open heart, pour that love into those you love most, and comfort and secure them.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it gets much simpler and clearer than that.
I hope so.
And you know, Terry, I just so appreciate it. You were warning me that I should rein you in, and you know, you can get on a roll when we're talking about that body of work that you were talking about, the distinctions and the graphs and so on. And we went there a little bit, but I've got to tell you, there's a way in which I'm moved by your openness, your generous openness in this conversation, and bringing this notion of before anything else that we need this resonance that you keep talking about. That there's it's like an opening. It seems like it's a doorway that you keep pointing to, and to keep making that resonance happen in whatever dimension we happen to be working in.
Well,
And
notice, if I may, just
yeah,
notice that it's relational. You
yeah,
don't get resonance by yourself. I mean, you can be in resonance with your own identity and so on, but you don't get real resonance until it's relational with something else.
yeah. And that's where you've landed us, you know, in ultimate, you know, really your final point is exactly there, is where the resonance occurs, is in our relationship and to care for one another. again, it just doesn't get much simpler than that. In a world that is trying so hard to stay in a willfully ignorant, distanced posture from all this. So I just appreciate it. You know, it's a really refreshing to have something boil down to something we all can understand. Hell, a 3-year-old can understand what it is to take care of one another.
Better than we do.
Yeah, right. So Terry Rankin, thank you so much for speaking with us here in the Take My Hand series. I look forward to having you back on the Poetry of Predicament in a later interview, and we can do some deep dive into that resonance that you keep talking about.
All right. It's been my pleasure, Dean. I always enjoy profound dialogues, and this is our second, so let's keep it going.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much, and I look forward to next time.
Same here. Have a blessed holiday season, by the way.
Thank you so much. Another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.